Welcome to the Lightwork Women podcast. We are experienced women with credibility. We know what life is like. Transform your life with our top-tier psychic and wellness services. We offer effective solutions tailored to empower you on your journey to spiritual wellness. In this podcast series, we talk about tarot, mediumship, Reiki, mental health, magic, witchcraft, and much, much more. We hope you enjoy our show. Please get a cuppa, have a seat, have a listen. And just remember, many hands make light work.
Neptune in Aries, awakening the spiritual warrior, or what else will we basically see coming ahead? Welcome to Lightwork Women. I am Tania Costa from Weaver of Life, astrologer, tarot reader, and wellness mentor. And today we're talking about one of the biggest astrological shifts of the decade. So let's get into it. For the past 13 years, Neptune has been swimming through its hometown sign of Pisces, wrapping us in dreams, illusions, and waves of deep spiritual connection. It's been a time of heightened intuition, artistic expression, and collective escapism. Neptune in Pisces asked us to surrender, to dissolve, to believe. But now the tide is turning. Neptune is leaving the mystical waters of Pisces and stepping into Aries at the end of March. It will travel through Aries until around October of this year before moving back into Pisces for its last hurrah when it finally settles into Aries in January 2026. The dreamer wakes up, the seeker becomes the warrior. The age of passive faith is shifting to bold action. This is a new era of spirituality. So what does this mean for us, for the world? Will we become spiritual trailblazers or reckless idolists? Will we finally chase our dreams or just set them on fire? Get ready, because Neptune in Aries isn't here to whisper, it's here to ignite. Today, we are diving deep into this cosmic shift with two incredible women, Robyn Ridley, modern mystic, coach and author, and Sara Gilbert from Life Spirit Connections, mystic astrologer, tarot reader, and palmist, to break down the themes, the possibilities, and how we can harness this wild, untamed energy. Now, that's a really big introduction, and planting some seeds of thoughts. So, Sara, I thought it'd be worth getting you to start and giving us and sharing some thoughts around what I've just said and what you think Neptune is all about.
Well, to me, Neptune tends to reveal what we idolize or what we hope and dream for. But the purpose of that is to redeem ourselves or to save ourselves. And unfortunately, in Pisces, a lot of this seems to be about idolizing deception because, it's been the era of fake news, propaganda, influencers, social media, illusions in general. And maybe moving into Aries, we're going to wake up to the reality behind the illusion, which would be really nice. So it's part of a great, big, huge shift in direction. Pluto in Aquarius sort of started it, but really it started back with Jupiter and Saturn going into the air signs back in 2020. It's on the move. It's going away from the watery, earthy signs into the fire and air signs, and we've got as well as Pluto going into Aquarius, we've got Uranus going into Gemini, and Jupiter into Cancer is in the old school, but we've got that whole theme going on of fire and air. So in the past, Neptune moving into Aries, and I mean moving into Aries isn't just changing sign, it's changing zodiacs, isn't it? It's going past the zero zodiac sign, and there's so many zeros happening this year all over the place. So many aspects being set up. But in the past, it's been very much about wars, rebellions, civil unrest. It is about fertility and new beginnings and creative life force. But hopefully out of it all, we're going to remember our true nature as eternal beings. In the last time, it was from 1861 to 1874, but we didn't have Saturn going into Aries as well at that time. So we didn't have the restraining qualities that come from Saturn. Civil wars seem to have gone a lot with Neptune in Aries, where we like fighting ourselves. We like fighting. Nations like taking on other parts of the nation, but there was the Civil Rights War in that period from 1861 to 1874. And as a result of that, slavery was abolished and everyone finally got the vote. Well, the men, that was. The women didn't get the vote for a long time afterwards, of course, as was the way of the world. The Red Cross was founded, which was a big positive, and the Trades Union Congress in the UK. Dr. Barnardo founded his society for finding homes for vulnerable children. So there's definitely some positives there. And there was continuing dissolution of the monarchy and the church and the state. And that was caused by an increasing emphasis on science and also spirituality, because we had all the psychic things coming in and people being interested in ghosts and sort of sciences and all of those sorts of things. So I guess this time round we could see those sorts of pioneering visions. It could be idealistic revolution, social activism, crusades to find out what the truth actually is. So at the best, it's going to be compassionate action and leadership. But unfortunately, if corruption and weakness of leaders gets exposed, as it's starting to seem to happen on the world stage, then we could end up with wars created as an accident out of that. So to me, a more spiritual perspective is going to be the best way to go. And, seeing through some of those illusions and learning to live with uncertainty, and a spiritual renaissance definitely is possible. But whatever happens, it's going to break down a lot of the sort of structures that we know, and we're going to have to be prepared to fit with it and deal with change, I think.
They're very big themes and historical themes that we're starting to see snippets. Well, not starting, it's been in the ether for a little while. But when it comes to, you made the point around truth that actual is and breaking down those illusions, and that the Aries is going to sort of drive that from a, so perhaps that is the agitator. I always look at things from the perspective that all those amazing things that you just mentioned that did exist happened as a result of that cycle, is that, there's a lot of agitation that made people go beyond and think and believe and start tapping into something that was untangible because they were disillusioned in many respects. So I kind of would pose the question to Robyn, from your perspective and looking at some of the themes that Sara mentioned regarding our historical themes, how do you feel that might play out in today's terms? Because, it's no longer the 1800s. We've all evolved and we have been able to tap into a more spiritual evolution, because I think that's what Neptune in Pisces has done for us. Whilst there has been illusion, it's also enabled us to tune in and tap into a different vibration on a different level. So, yeah, what's your thoughts around that?
Well, I actually believe it's probably a great time for us to be looking at, the shifts on a collective consciousness as well as our individual experiences. So it gives us the opportunity to, like for me, I like to look at things closer to home because there's a ripple out effect. For me, I was looking at the archetype of the spiritual warrior. Now, we all know that the warrior is, a warrior is can be a fighter. And the spiritual aspect, like for Neptune, is the beautiful mystic. Now, Do they go well together? Not necessarily. We know that there can be this, this friction. But what I often refer to when we're looking from an evolutionary perspective is, okay, we've got this, we could have this agitation and this struggle, but in that, there's a need to learn to integrate and to work together. Now, that's not always the case. So if we think of that Aries energy, like the warrior energy, the warriors were fighters. They wore those masks, which was all about the fear, so it was about bringing in that fear. Even if we look at shamanism, they wore masks and it was to frighten. So our role is, instead of tapping into the fear, is to actually look at how we can move beyond that. It's like, well, how do we focus and gain the clarity that we need to overcome this engulfing presence that we can have with this powerful energy. Mars's or Aries, sorry, which is ruled by Mars, is a very powerful energy, and there's no, if there's something going on, the warrior is going to fight and the mystic is going to back down. So this is where we need, as Sara said, to bring that spiritual component in, the mystic. It's like, so is it like a mystical, it's like a courage, if you like, a courage that one has to learn. And it's a shame because if we look at it on an individual level over time, how quite often people have that sense of, sometimes they have that sense of spirituality in that time of fear or that time of panic. So the idea is not to go to panic, but to work through the fear. And you think about it in war, if someone's in the trenches and they're getting shot at, they may pray, God, help me, God, help me. And that's like, sometimes it's the last resort, that spiritual cry for help, if you like. So everything that Sara said, I totally understand, but I just like to bring it back to something more tangible for me. And I was thinking, I was reading an example with Stephen Forrest about a plane going down. If a plane's going down, then, everybody's going for where they're going to get help. And I wanted to share, if you don't mind, an example of this because it was just amazing. So I'd been over to Hawaii on a holiday, which was fantastic, by the way. And I'd get back to Sydney. I had to get, a regional flight back to Wagga Wagga before going to work the next day. So we're on this flight to Wagga Wagga. We were coming into Wagga Wagga and they said, the lights come on saying that the landing gear is faulty. And we have to go back to Sydney because Wagga doesn't have the emergency services for us to land. So here we are, everyone on the plane sort of going, oh gosh, so the decibels in the plane reduced. The idiot that was jumping around like a jackass started to diffuse and get a bit quieter. When we got back to Sydney on the runway, there were fire engines down both sides of the runway. Well, I kid you not, you couldn't hear a pin drop. So I guess what I'm saying is, even on a collective level, there was this unspoken, how are we moving through the fear? Were we praying? Were we going to that stillness and that consciousness deep within ourselves? But it was just like there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing. And in that moment, I believe this is that spiritual component that we're talking about. But it's about bringing it more into our lives if we can, and the things that we do. The spiritual warrior, that's what this is about. And it's about moving through that fear and the shock and tapping into our spiritual courage, and then just seeing any inner conflicts that we have, seeing them. Oh God, how are we going to cope with this? Whatever's going on for us. But on a global level, obviously, a lot of that can be out of our control. And then that beautiful visionary leadership, there is that potential. So I guess for me, I could talk more about the other side of that coin, but I'd be happy for you girls to have a bit of a chat about.
Well, I'm in alignment with you, Robyn. I think the spiritual warrior, and even from an Aries perspective, is about standing up for what you believe in. And I think if we bring in is that convergence of that Neptune Aries polarity, which there is, it's intention. It's not something that weaves together easily. But if we're bringing in what we've learned from Neptune in the last 14 years in Pisces, the idea is to integrate that. That's that evolution. And whilst, we might be highly optimistic, it is a vibration that we're heading towards. And I think the warrior is about standing up for what you believe in and fighting for it. And fight doesn't mean it has to be aggressive. Although typically, I guess, from a Aries energy, the warrior can be an aggressor. But in this context, I think with Neptune being the powerhouse that, that is holding that space, I think there's a great opportunity for the paradigm to shift. And the things that are happening globally at the moment are those agitators. I truly believe that as horrifying for some, it's not horrifying, but as horrifying as it is, it's these very things that create the shift. Through chaos, creation is created, from a metaphoric perspective. And so we have to be very mindful of, definitely, as Sara mentioned, all the things that we've learned from. And that's the thing, what did we learn from those 1800s? And those constraints, you said slavery was abolished. And I think that's a massive thing because, again, we may not have, well, we still have modern day slavery, but, as a metaphor, that's about breaking free and being true and individuation and having freedom and having the freedom to be able to do things. And so on that, Sara, how do you feel that narrative around Aries and that freedom and that the individuation and the self might play out in this period of time, or what can we learn from that for ourselves?
Well, we have to learn what is our identity going to be, because Aries is about your own identity and asserting yourself and putting that out there. And a lot of these new changes have all been, I think AI comes into all of them, but it's how we're going to use that, how we're going to promote ourselves forward. If I could tell a little bit of the story, I always like to look back to what happened when the sign changed, because I'm not that old in astrology. And in 2011, when Neptune went into Pisces, was when I started my spiritual business. Really, I was doing stuff before that, but I actually had an ankle operation, and I could no longer go out and teach outside of my home because I wasn't mobile. So it was the force that made me set up my own home business and home spiritual college. And that happened exactly when Neptune went into Pisces. So, it's out of things that perhaps seem unfortunate, like the world situation at the moment, that we move forward and take the steps that we need to take in order to bring our own imprint on it, I think. So maybe that's there's something that we're all going to be able to do to stamp our energy on it, because obviously we all want it to be spiritual and not war, sort of it. But we've got war, haven't we, at the moment?
Well, we do. And, drawing on that, perhaps it's propagating that individuation around ourself, our spiritual self, but how we drive that, because it is a fire energy. The Pisces, it was in its hometown, so it's kind of feeling like it needs to be, lost in its delusions and illusions and dreams but at the same token, that through that process has enabled, I think, everyone to connect with them like a higher consciousness, accessing the intuitive faculties, or the unseen. And your point, Sara, that you started your business that in that time, and I think a lot of things have grown in that period of time, the last 14 years, when it comes to the spiritual. You can see we're like bombarded by it through social media, and there's been a massive wave of change. And now I do feel that it's going to be driven in a different way, and it's going to be directed. And I think now you're going to follow your beliefs. What, the belief of what you aspire and promote and what you believe to be true. And so I think the spiritual warrior can be seen in so many different ways. So, Robyn, from your perspective, you know, we mentioned not in this conversation, but you like the idea of drawing on archetypal energy, and that's, I guess, that spiritual warrior.
Yeah.
What other areas or what other themes or archetypes do you think are relevant when it comes to Neptune in Aries that we should be tapping into?
Well, I think very much the pioneer as well. All the things that have previously been, I believe, but I think we need to be mindful, as Sarah said, of what's gone before. And for me, it's very much about looking at the effects of that, the effects of the archetypes. Like we all know, there's the visionary, the mystic, you know, all of those, the pioneer, the leader, all those different archetypes. We can draw on all of those. But what we're looking at is the two together and how they're working together. So for me, I think it's now that I probably might tap on those few challenges that we could have, and that's how we can have that impulsive decision making, you know, in both ways. And then I think ego versus spirit. And I think one of the biggest things that we make a mistake with, we think spirit, when we're working in spirit, there's no ego. No.
No.
So I think, you know, when you think of ego versus spirit, you could say, okay, well, there's Aries and Neptune, but no, because they cross over, and ego can very much be found in spirit, in inverted commas. So I think it's really important to see that. And the other aspect is the vulnerability of doing things differently. So, you know, if you think of where Neptune's been over the last 14 or so years, it's like, okay, well, it could have been having a happy time swimming around in there, you know, like it was but there was definitely, it wasn't at odds, but what did it accomplish? And we're already seeing some of the things that have gone askew. But when we see now that there's a shift and there's this whole fire energy, it's like there's a passion can be ignited here, you know, a beautiful enlightened action, if you like, where we have the opportunity to manifest some ideas. You know, how does that happen? That's open for debate, open for discussion. It's a whole other topic, I believe. But I think in knowing that in developing our consciousness, clarity and focus are key as we step into that spiritual courage and move beyond that fear and shock of everything that has been before, of everything that is yet to be, and all that is within, whether it be within systems, within ourselves, within whatever. So I just feel that the elephant in the room, and I want to go back because I did say this before about the warrior the warrior can fight, and the energy of the mystic can also be about turning the other cheek, or actually goes into that practicing of kindness and forgiveness. And how do they go together when they're both working at that level? So it's like we have to somehow work with those archetypes, allow them to weave their magic together. Do you like that word, magic? Oh dear, I wonder where I got that from. So I think, I don't know, there's a lot to learn over the next 14 or so years. I think it is that long, isn't it? I think
it is. It's about that much. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot. And I think even within ourselves, there's a lot. So if we look at it on a collective consciousness, we're off to a rocky start. But
And that's a really good segue, because I was thinking, Sarah, you know, you've got a lot of knowledge around the historical aspects of, you know, Neptune in Aries. What would be like if you could define, you know, one or three key lessons learned from that period? What would be the key things that we would need to bring into that next evolution? Because it's the next cycle. You know, we can't keep repeating past experiences, but if there were some key themes that emerged during the 1800s that we could apply in today's terms, what were the areas that you think you would?
Well, we're still fighting for equality for everybody, aren't we? You know, sort of we abolished slavery, but women were still slaves, you know, sort of women didn't get their rights for a long time. So how inclusive all the changes are, how the changes bring everyone into things. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, there seems to be wars. Wars seems to be a common theme through all the thoughts. So is it, how can we have wars that are less disastrous? I mean, when you look at what's gone on in the Middle East, and you see all that devastation, it's, how can we prevent those sort of things happening again? They're the, sort of war seems to be the answer to it, but then how do we clean up the mess that war leaves behind? Is probably some of the biggest lessons. And I suppose with the spiritualism, they got a bit carried away with all the seances and all that side of it, rather than going into the way we see spirituality more today. So, how do we view spirituality, I suppose? What does it mean? Because I think things are going to get broken up and decentralized, whatever we want, sort of, I think that the church and religion and the state and all of those things are going to get more and more decentralized. So I think what Robyn said about, it's what comes from inside, the archetypes that you bring out inside yourself is going to be the important thing that helps you deal with the fear of change and all those other things.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think the archetype, from an Aries perspective around the pioneer, their mantra is I am. It's the self. It's very self-driven. But I feel with the Neptune overlay, perhaps that's where it can encompass a much more expansive pathway to the evolution of, how do we as individuals stand up to the things that don't align with our truth and what we believe in. And I think then as a collective, it becomes a stronger voice because the individual has that drive to, propel what they believe in and not be a bystander. And I think that's perhaps part of the change that, Pisces could probably, not that they're the bystander, but they're more likely to, meander and go with the flow. Whereas the Aries energy is like, no, I'm actually fed up with this. It's time for me to do something about it. And so, I think that the idea of that spiritual warrior being born or emerging is, I think, a really great archetype to sort of move towards over this next period, because there's going to be a lot of shifts and changes, and but it's going to be driven. It's a directed energy, and in the past it was expansive and there was no form. Whereas now, yes, it can be ignited and it expand into a massive explosion. But I always feel, like I said previously, in the chaos, creation is the end game. And we're going to be really uncomfortable around it. But I think that's what's so beautiful about this Neptune Aries energy and shift. And it's not just Neptune, it's like all the powerhouse planets. We're all moving. And to your point, Sarah, earlier around how we're at this zero, and Aries is the first sign. So Neptune's moving into a completely new cycle. So whilst we can have lessons learned from the past, it's now starting a new pathway. And how do you feel? What's your thoughts around how Neptune then plays out with what else, everything else that's happening in the skies, in the cosmos? Because there's massive shifts. Who's dominating what? They're all dominating because they're like, we're all here to shake things up.
I think it's having the courage to be able to stand up for what you believe in, with combining the Neptune and the Aries in amongst all the other change that's going to happen with the Uranus going into Aries and Pluto already being in Aquarius. They're whole new regimes, aren't they? And it is a bit frightening to sort of think about how it's all going to combine together.
Yes.
And then next year, when Saturn and Neptune finally get absolutely conjunct in February, sort of what's all that going to mean? You know, there's a lot to process, isn't there?
There's a lot to unpack, and I think, this year, Neptune is still going to have a cameo back into Pisces. So there's a few things that, that retrograde, is about retrieval. So it's that opportunity to kind of tap into, the vast amount of resource that, Neptune in Pisces has provided, and bring it in so that we can propel forward with the Aries energy next year. So I think this is going to be a bit of a, I call it a transition year. There's a lot of transitions. And so with all the major planets, and so it's not going to be clear how things will play out, but we're going to get some good little cues.
Definitely.
But as we wrap up, what's your final words? I guess, Robyn, what would you
Well, I
want to
think,
tell the listeners?
yeah, I think the nebulous energy of Neptune it's sort of a forerunner, if you like, of not everything is known. So we don't know all that it's not form. It hasn't taken form. So it's that movement and flow, and things could change, but knowing what we know and knowing its placement or movement into Aries, I like to look at the quickly as I finish up, mention the opportunities. And I've noted 3 opportunities: the pioneering spirit. So we have the potential for the pioneering spirit, the empathetic leadership. That sounds impressive, doesn't it? Is it possible? Let's go. Let's not discount that. It is an opportunity. And then the third one, of course, is spiritual growth. For whom, but that's the ultimate, when we're looking at that energy of the spiritual warrior, there is that potential for spiritual growth. So I like the way that they can all blend in together, but it is going to be a learning curve.
It's definitely going to be a ride. And Sarah, what's your final thoughts regarding this massive
I
transition?
think really just being able to stand in our truth and be able to be, as I said before, not letting fear get too much in the way, and just going for what we believe in. And it sounds all very, very spiritual and woofy, but sort of trying to help to get more people understanding what needs to be understood in the collective, because we've only got a very small number of people that sort of really appreciate these sorts of things. So trying to grow that by being a spiritual warrior is the big aim, I think.
Absolutely. And, my final words would be, I also associate Aries as a, a birthing, a rebirthing. So it's kind of, we've just emerging, starting again. It's a new beginning. And with any new beginnings, there's going to be, challenges and teething and, trying to work things through. And I think bringing in what we've learned from the Neptune in Pisces and that tapping into our spiritual self is what we need to anchor so that we can drive and face those challenges, those roadblocks or the agitators or the, the destruction that potentially could come through, but remember to tune into our inner selves. And I think that's a really nice wrap up for Neptune and working through these crazy polarities. So let's see what happens. And it's a big topic, so I'm sure we can probably draw on talking about Neptune in so many different layers, and it's going to have different, like you said, aspects and relationships to other planets over the coming periods. So let's wait and see. So thank you, ladies. That was a really good little rundown on a very massive topic. And I appreciate your time, Sarah and Robyn.
Thank you.
Thank you for the
Wonderful.
hosting.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Lightwork Women. If you'd like to find out more about any of the guests on our show and our practitioners, visit our website, lightworkwomen.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.